There is a truth about human achievement that the world does not publish freely, because to publish it honestly would require most men to make uncomfortable decisions about the people they have chosen to keep close. The truth is this: the people permitted into the nearest proximity of a man's mind are not merely companions or colleagues or friends in the ordinary social sense of that word. They are architects. Every word spoken within his hearing, every attitude absorbed through sustained daily contact, every dominant thought, borrowed consciously or not from the minds of those around him, is working to this very hour upon the structure of his ambition, his faith, and his capacity for achievement, for better or for worse. I spent 25 years, the better part of my working life, studying more than 500 men who had accumulated great fortunes and more than 25,000 who had failed to accumulate anything resembling financial or personal independence. I sat across from the wealthiest industrialists of an age and from men who had spent decades working to escape poverty without success, and I made a discovery that I consider to be among the most practically important of my entire career. In almost every case of serious sustained failure, the man's closest associations had played a decisive role. Not the only role, not the sole cause, but a decisive one, operating through a law that most men never examine, called the law of hypnotic rhythm, through which the dominant thought habits of a man's closest environment settle through repetition into the permanent fabric of his own mind. What follows are the 9 behaviors I have identified through 25 years of evidence as the 9 most reliable instruments through which a man's inner circle can be turned against him. Not through malice in most cases, not through deliberate sabotage, but through the operation of a law as indifferent to his preferences as gravitation, working upon the minds of both the man and his associates every hour they spend in each other's company. I am Napoleon Hill, and what follows is not a set of preferences. It is a warning drawn from the evidence of 500 lives. Behavior 1, the man who robs you of your enthusiasm before you begin. The persistent doubter and the invisible tax he levies on every idea you bring him. Enthusiasm is the mainspring of soul. It is the force that carries a man from the desire for a thing to the organized action required to attain it. Without it, the finest plan lies still. With it, a man of modest resources can set into motion a force that accumulates beyond what any observer predicted at the outset. But enthusiasm is also the most vulnerable force a man carries. It is most fragile at the exact moment it is most needed, at the beginning, before any result has been produced and before any evidence of success is available to defend the idea against doubt. And the man who habitually meets new ideas in that tender early state, with the instinct to find the reason they will not work, is extracting at the most critical moment the very force that would have carried the idea forward. This is the invisible tax. I want to describe for you an incident that illustrated this principle with a precision I have never since seen matched. A securities company in Chicago employed more than 1,500 salespeople. To keep the ranks filled, the company trained 600 new people every week. One training session produced a young man who, by his own honest admission when he entered the class, had never tried to sell securities and was not certain he was a salesman. He was unremarkable in appearance. By the assessment of the experienced men in the organization, he was green, naive enough in the private estimate of the stars to be the object of a practical joke. One of those stars told the newcomer, with the authority of his accumulated experience and the confidence of a man who knows his business, that there was a wealthy artist in the city who would buy securities with almost no effort. The star just didn't want to bother with so easy a sale. What the star did not tell the newcomer was that every accomplished salesman in the firm had called on this artist and failed, some for weeks at a time. The artist had sent one of them away with instructions never to return. The newcomer went. He returned an hour and a half later with a check for $2,000 and a description of the artist as a perfect gentleman and a very interesting man. The stars demanded to know how, and the newcomer explained. When he arrived, he found the artist at work on a painting. He stood and looked at it without a word until the artist noticed him. He then talked not about securities, not about himself, not about the purpose of his visit, but about the painting, about art, about the particular picture on the easel, which he found genuinely interesting, and said so frankly, with the full force of his genuine enthusiasm for what he was seeing. For nearly an hour, the two men talked about nothing but art. At the end, the artist asked the salesman's name and his business. The salesman replied, "Never mind my business. I am more interested in you and your art." The artist insisted. And then, with what appeared to be reluctant sincerity, the salesman described the securities briefly. The artist bought $2,000 worth without hesitation. Not one of the 1,500 other people in that organization who had been told this principle had applied it. Their collective doubt that genuine interest in another man could be more powerful than practiced technique had strangled the application of a truth they had been given. Now, I want to show you the law that this incident illustrates, and then show you how the persistent doubter operates it upon the man who keeps him close. Man who keeps him close. When a man's mind is vibrating at a high rate because it's been stimulated by genuine enthusiasm, that vibration registers in the minds of all with its radius, especially those with whom he is in close contact. The principle of suggestion operates continuously between minds in proximity. What you say, what you do, and what you think all influence the people near you, whether you intend that influence or not. The reverse is equally true. The man whose dominating mental state is doubt, who habitually approaches new ideas by searching for the mechanism of their failure, broadcasts that state of mind into every association he enters. And through the law of hypnotic rhythm, which takes whatever thought habits are repeated most frequently in a man's environment and makes them permanent, the persistent doubter's dominant frequency settles over time into the thought habits of the man who keeps him closest. The tax is subtle. A man does not notice at first that his ideas are arriving smaller than when they left him. He does not observe in the early stages that the fire he felt when he conceived a plan was cooler after he described it to a certain person than it was before. He notices only the result. Less action taken, more plans abandoned, a growing habit of entertaining ambitious ideas privately and never speaking them aloud. Because speaking them aloud has become associated with the sensation of being diminished. The test of the persistent doubter is not a single skeptical remark. Every man who thinks carefully has skeptical impulses about ideas that are worth questioning. The test is the pattern. Does this person across many different conversations over time consistently find the reason things will not work? Is your enthusiasm in his presence reliably smaller when you leave than when you arrived? If the answer is yes, the tax is real. Remove him from the position of first counsel. He may remain in your life in other capacities, but the man who carries a burning desire cannot afford to bring its first tender, undefended expression to the persistent doubter's door. Behavior 2, the man who criticizes you to others while flattering you to your face, the double-tongued associate and the corruption he deposits in every interaction. Among the most precise and accurate descriptions of a failed character that Hill ever assembled is the portrait of the drifter, the man whose life has been surrendered to drift, whose habits of thought have been organized by circumstance rather than by deliberate purpose. And within that portrait, one quality appears with such characteristic regularity that it serves as a signature. The drifter, if he works for others, will criticize them to their backs and flatter them to their faces. This is not presented as one flaw among many of roughly equal weight. It is presented as the natural expression of a man whose relationship with truth has been so thoroughly corrupted by the habit of drift that the social surface of his behavior has become entirely disconnected from the substance of his actual assessment. He says one thing, he means another. And the repetition of this pattern through the law of hypnotic rhythm has made it as natural to him as breathing. Now I want to speak to you directly about what this behavior costs the man who tolerates it in his inner circle. I received a lesson on this matter not from a book, but from my own experience. that impressed itself upon me with a force I have never lost. I had developed during the early part of my public career what I believed to be a genuine commitment to honesty in my dealings with others. I prided myself on saying what I meant and meaning what I said. I believed this was the policy not merely of good character, but of practical wisdom. A man who cannot be trusted to say what he thinks cannot be trusted with anything else. Then, without warning, a man I had regarded as an associate revealed that he had been maintaining in private an opinion of my work that bore no resemblance to what he had expressed to my face. He had praised it to me and attacked it to others. And I was, for a moment, genuinely shocked, not primarily because of the betrayal, but because I recognized in that moment that I had been providing him with the information he needed to do damage in the good faith that what he received from me in private would be treated with the discretion I extended to everything he shared with me. I had been operating as though the social surface of the relationship were its substance. He had been exploiting the gap between the two. Here's what I want you to understand about the double-tongued associate's particular form of damage. It is not primarily the damage he does to your reputation through his private communications about you, though that is real. It is the damage he does to your capacity to trust the social surface of any relationship. The man who keeps a double-tongued associate close enough long enough absorbs through the law of hypnotic rhythm the double-tongued associate's fundamental assumption that what people say to you and what they mean are two different things. This assumption, once settled into a man's thought habits with sufficient depth, produces one of the most destructive possible conditions for achievement: a general suspicion of all social exchange, a defensive posture toward every relationship, open, genuine engagement with other minds that the mastermind principle requires. There is but one practical response to the double-tongued man in the inner circle, and it is not confrontation. It is not reformation through example. The habit he carries has been made permanent through the law of hypnotic rhythm, and it cannot be argued away. Of intimacy. He may be treated with courtesy. I have always advocated for courtesy, even toward those whose habits of character cannot be reformed. But he must not be trusted with the contents of your plans, your doubts, aspirations, and he must not be given the position of daily companion where the law of association does its most work. Behavior 3. The man who makes his own failure your responsibility, the blame shifter, and the habit that destroys every alliance. Among the 30 major causes of failure I identified in my research, one recurs with such mechanical consistency in the lives of those who fail that I came to regard it not as a character flaw in the ordinary sense, but as a habit of thought, one as destructive as any of the 6 basic fears, and considerably more difficult to detect because it wears the cost rather than the costume of weakness. The habit is this: blaming others for one's mistakes and accepting unfavorable circumstances unavoidable. It is worth examining carefully why this habit is so precisely destructive, because the destruction it produces is not immediately visible. A man who blames others for his failures does not appear in the short run to be failing. He appears to be a man who has been failed. And this distinction matters enormously for the effect the habit has upon those who associate with him. Because the man who appears to be a victim of other people's choices rather than the architect of his own conditions is perpetually accompanied by a claim, unspoken but pervasive, that the circumstances of his life are produced by forces outside himself. And a man who has accepted that claim about his own life will, through the law of association, begin to accept it about the life of anyone who keeps him close. I want to describe what the opposite of this looks like, because the contrast is instructive. The non-drifter, the man whom I have described throughout my drifter is not, never blames others for his mistakes, no matter if they deserve the blame. He has a clear memory and never offers an alibi for his shortcomings. If asked a question, he gives a direct answer and never falls back on evasions or subterfuge. When he meets with defeat, his reaction is to fight rather than to surrender. And when he fights the situation rather than the character of the people who contributed to it. This is not moral idealism. It is the most practical possible response to failure because it preserves in the exact moment when it is most needed the only power through which the situation can actually be changed. A man who places the cause of his failure outside himself has also placed the remedy outside himself. He is waiting for conditions to change, for other people to behave differently, for the world to rearrange itself into a form more hospitable to his ambitions. And this waiting, sustained long enough, becomes his permanent condition. I assembled in the course of my research a list of 57 famous alibis, the excuses most commonly offered by those who failed to explain why they have not achieved what they wish to achieve. If I had money, if I had an education, if times were better, if other people understood me, if I had been given a chance, if I could only do what I want. Every one of them carries the same structural feature. The cause of failure is placed outside the man who is failing. The man in your inner circle who reliably reaches for these alibis, who, when things go wrong, with remarkable speed, a narrative in the cause is elsewhere and the remedy must come from elsewhere, is not merely unpleasant company. He is a generator of the specific thought habit that is most reliably fatal to achievement, the habit of waiting for the world to change rather than self. Responsibility, and all that comes with it in the way of increased capacity, potential reward, gravitates always to the person who will not accept temporary defeat as permanent failure. The blame shifter does not merely fail to attract this gravity. His presence in the inner circle repels it from those who associate with him. Keep him close and he will teach you to wait. The waiting will become, through hypnotic rhythm, your permanent condition. Behavior 4. The man who brings his unresolved fears into every conversation, how the fear carrier is poison through every room. Fear is nothing more than a state of mind. I have stated this in every major work I have produced, and I state it again here with the emphasis it deserves. Fear is a state of mind, nothing else. It has no substance. It carries no physical weight. It is not produced by the circumstances it claims to describe. It is a thought habit, as susceptible to direction and control as any other thought habit, and as capable of being redirected through the deliberate practice of autosuggestion as any other negative condition of the mind. But the fact that fear is only a state of mind does not make it harmless. It makes it more dangerous. Because a state of mind is contagious in precisely the way that a physical disease is not. Through proximity, through sustained association, through the principle of telepathy that operates between minds without pause and without the possibility of opt-out. When a man's mind is vibrating at a high rate because of genuine enthusiasm and genuine purpose, that vibration transmits to those within its radius. The principle works in both directions. When a distant, sustained frequency of unresolved fear, fear of poverty, of criticism, of failure, of what other people think, it transmits that frequency with equal faithfulness to every mind in its immediate environment. I want you to consider what happened in the years I observed most closely when the dominant thought habit of an entire nation was the fear of poverty. This was not a period of genuine scarcity. The factories had not stopped, the fields still produced. The infrastructure that carries goods from where they are made to where they are needed was intact. What had collapsed was not the physical capacity for production and exchange. It was the dominant thought habit of millions of minds organized by the law of hypnotic rhythm around the fear of poverty, and thereby producing the conditions of poverty as reliably as a planted seed produces its particular crop. If a shared thought held by millions can produce that result at the level what a thought held by one person in intimate daily association with another can produce at the level of a single man's faith and ambition. The 7 basic fears: poverty, criticism, ill health, loss of love, old age, death, and the 7th affliction that Hill calls more deeply seated than all the others combined, susceptibility to negative influences. This 7th affliction is the precise mechanism through which the fear carrier does his damage in the inner circle. It strikes without the awareness of the man it is striking. It consists merely of a state of mind arriving, not through deliberate action by the fear carrier, but through the law of hypnotic rhythm operating upon the shared environment of close association. The symptoms of the fear of poverty, as I have identified them with great precision, include indifference, the willingness to tolerate whatever life offers without protest, indecision, the habit of permitting others to do one's thinking, overcaution, the habit of looking for the negative side of every circumstance, knowing all the roads to disaster but never searching for the plans to failure, and procrastination, the habit of putting off until tomorrow what should have been done last year. These are not personality traits to be accommodated. They are symptoms of a fear-infected environment that is operating upon your thought habits. Whether or not you have identified the source, the protective measure is both simple and difficult. Choose with the care a man exercises in selecting the food on which he intends to build his physical strength, the dominating thought habits of those with whom you associate most closely. One's intimate associates should be chosen with as much care as one chooses one's food, with the object always of associating with people whose dominating thoughts are positive, friendly, and harmonious. The man who regularly leaves a conversation more afraid than when he entered it has not been with a friend. He has been with a carrier. And the law that makes the carrier's frequency permanent in his own mind is the same law that will make it permanent if the exposure is sustained long enough. Behavior 5. The man who talks without doing and advises without knowing. The opinion monger and the damage of uninformed counsel. The habit of expressing loosely organized opinions, of speaking with authority about things one has not examined with accuracy, of offering confident assessments of plans one has not studied, of advising on outcomes one has not produced, is one of the most destructive habits in the entire catalog of habits that Hill identified as enemies of success. It is destructive first to the man who practices it because it develops in him through the law of hypnotic rhythm what I have elsewhere called a grasshopper mind, one that jumps from one subject to another, collecting impressions, forming opinions, expressing those opinions with the confidence of knowledge they do not possess, and never staying with any single thing long enough to develop the accurate knowledge that opinion giving so convincingly simulates. And it is destructive to those who tolerate it in their inner circle because it fills the shared environment with the confident sound of guesswork wearing the costume of experience. And guesswork, heard often enough from a source that appears authoritative, eventually displaces the man's own considered judgment. I want to draw your attention to the 57 famous alibis again because the opinion monger is their primary manufacturer. People who do not succeed have one distinguishing trait in common. They know all the reasons for failure and have what they believe to be airtight alibis to explain away their own lack of achievement. The man who freely offers his opinion on your plans, the authority of his experience and the confidence of his personality, but who has not himself produced the result he is advising you to pursue, is drawing on this same stock of alibis. His counsel is the crystallization of his own failure dressed in the authority of advice. Consider again the experienced salesman who sent the newcomer to the artist as a joke. Every one of them had tried and failed to sell to this man. Every one of them had concluded from their failure that the sale could not be made. Their collective expert opinion, drawn from collective experience, was offered with the confidence that experience produces. And it was wrong. Not because they lacked experience, but because their experience had produced conclusions about what was possible that were drawn from the limits of their own approach rather than from any accurate assessment of what was possible in itself. The newcomer, who did not know their opinion, simply went and found out. He returned with a check for $2,000. Wise men keep their plans to themselves and refrain from expressing uninvited opinions. This is advice I have given throughout my career and considered among the most important practical instructions available. It prevents others from appropriating ideas before they are ready to be acted upon. And it avoids the particular interference that uninvited counsel brings, the introduction into the private planning space where ideas are still forming of other people's conclusions about what is possible. The man who volunteers his opinion on your plan is not doing you a service unless his opinion is grounded in accurate knowledge of the specific territory and unless you have asked for it with genuine intention to consider it. In any other case, He is introducing into the early vulnerable stage of your planning the conclusions he has reached from the limits of his own experience. And those conclusions may be the cage that held him where he stands. There is a further harm. The opinion monger requires, by the logic of reciprocity that governs all social exchange, that the man who listens to him participate in the exchange. He wants an audience. He wants his opinion. He wants his opinions to be received, considered, engaged with. And the time and attention that this exchange consumes are the hours that should have been spent in the organized, deliberate action that produces accurate knowledge rather than confident opinion. Stop bringing your plans to the man who has no plan of his own. His enthusiasm or his caution about your vision is equally worthless because neither is grounded in the knowledge that execution alone produces. Find instead the counsel of who have done the particular thing you are attempting to do, and even then, take their experience as data rather than as verdict. Behavior 6. The man who has no definite purpose and resents yours, the settled drifter and the silent war he wages on every man who refuses to join him. The drifter is the most exhausted man in any room he enters. I established this in examining the invisible cost of purposeless expenditure. He is also, in many cases, the most dangerous man in a room. Not through any deliberate act of sabotage, but through the sustained ambient operation of the law of harmony, which nature employs to press every individual in a given environment toward conform dominant frequency. Let me give you the full portrait of the drifter. Not a partial description, but the complete picture as it emerged from my most thorough inquiry into the habits of failure. The first thing you will notice about a drifter is his total lack of a major purpose in life. He is conspicuous by his lack of self-confidence. He will never accomplish anything requiring thought and effort. He lacks enthusiasm and initiative to begin anything he is not forced to undertake. He takes the line of least resistance whenever it presents itself. He is ill-tempered and lacking in emotional control. His personality carries no magnetism. He will criticize others who are succeeding in their chosen calling. He will expect everything of others, but be willing to give little or nothing in return. He may begin many things, but will complete nothing. He will work harder to get out of thinking than most men work to earn a good living. He will tell a lie rather than admit his ignorance. He will reverse decisions at the first opportunity. He will begin many things and finish nothing. Now, I want you to note something in this portrait that is often missed. The drifter will criticize others who are succeeding in their chosen calling. This is not an incidental detail. It is central to understanding why the settled drifter in a man's inner circle is not merely uninspiring, but actively hostile, however subtly, to any ambition that rises above the level he himself accepted. Consider the man who took a leave of absence from his position as a streetcar conductor when he tried a new commercial position. He said to a friend, "If I do not succeed in holding my new position, I can always come back to the old job." At the end of the month, he was back. He had returned to the retreat he had left available, and he was, by his own account, completely cured of ambition to do anything except work on the streetcar. The retreat was the old job, the settled, known, safe position of the man who has accepted his station and made peace with it. Had he resigned instead of asking for a leave of absence, the pressure of genuine commitment, of having burned the ships behind him, might have produced in him the effort that partial commitment could not. The retreat available made the retreat inevitable. The settled drifter in a man's inner circle is this retreat made social and permanent. His settled life is a continuous ambient argument for the reasonableness of settling. His comfortable accommodation with less than he might have had is a daily visible testimony that the ambition the man with purpose is pursuing is not the ordinary expectation of ordinary people. And through the law of harmony, through which nature presses every individual toward conformity with the dominating influence of his environment, the settled drifter exerts upon the man who keeps him close a invisible, unmeasurable, but entirely real pressure toward the level he himself occupies. The law is not malicious. The drifter is rarely malicious. But the law of harmony does not require malice to operate. It requires only sustained proximity. Men who succeed always insist upon harmony among their business associates, and the harmony they insist upon is not the harmony of pleasant social exchange, but the harmony of minds operating at the same level of definiteness and purpose. Nature permits no one to escape the influences of his environment. She permits every man, however, to establish his own environment. The man who chooses his inner circle with the deliberate care that this principle demands has exercised the one form of environmental control that nature makes available to him. Behavior 7. The man who uses your loyalty against you. How jealousy and possession drain the inner resources of ambition. I have described in my analysis of the 6 basic fears that the fear of loss of love of someone is probably the most painful of all the 6, and the one that plays the most havoc with the body and mind. I want to be direct about why I have placed this fear in its particular position on the list, not because of its frequency, which is matched by others, but because of its consequences. It often leads in its advanced form to permanent damage of the reasoning faculty. And the person who deliberately exploits this fear in another, who uses jealousy, possessiveness, and the manufactured insecurity of threatened withdrawal as instruments of control, is working with the most potent possible tool for the destruction of another man's capacity for organized, purposeful effort. Jealousy is a form of insanity. I have stated this with precision in my work, and I effort. Jealousy is a form of insanity. I have stated this with precision in my work, and I state it again here without apology. Jealousy is a form of what the physicians of my time called dementia, a condition in which the imagination, operating in the absence of factual support, constructs elaborate structures of threat and suspicion, and then behaves as though those structures were established reality. The jealous person suspects without evidence. They accuse without cause. They find fault upon the slightest provocation or without any provocation whatsoever. And they do all of this with an intensity that derives not from any threat that actually exists, but from the fear of loss that drives the imagination to manufacture threats in the absence of real ones. Peace and happiness can never belong to the man who carries this rider unmastered in his own mind. Neither can they belong to the man who tolerates in his closest association another person unmastered in his own mind. Neither can they belong to the man who tolerates in his closest association another person whose primary instrument of relationship is the manufacturing of jealousy and insecurity in those they claim to love. Here is the precise cost stated in terms of achievement. The intimate associations, the partner in the home, the daily companion, exercise a great influence upon a man's thought habits than any other environmental force. The relationship of this closeness brings people under the influence of forces so pervasive that they become dominating forces of the mind. This means that the emotional environment of the closest association is not a backdrop to the man's pursuit of his purpose. It is the primary medium through which his thought habits are formed. A man whose most intimate environment is organized around the manufactured insecurity of jealousy will find that emotional instability settling into his thought habits through the law of hypnotic rhythm. Regardless of how thoroughly he believes he is managing it, the specific resources consumed by this settling are the resources of attention, emotional energy, and organized thought that a definite chief aim requires. These resources are not limitless. They are drawn from a daily supply that does not replenish itself in proportion to the demands placed upon it. Every hour spent managing manufactured emotional instability is an hour not spent in the organized, deliberate, purposeful effort that moves a man toward the attainment of his definite chief aim. And the law of hypnotic rhythm, operating upon these habitual patterns of expenditure, will in time make the expenditure automatic, will make the habit of managing emotional drama as natural as breathing, and will leave diminishing reserves for the work that actually matters. The tolerance of deliberate emotional manipulation is loyalty. It is a slow surrender of the inner resources through which a man builds the life he was made for, and it is made more dangerous, not less, by the fact that it wears the costume of love. Behavior 8. The man who takes your time as though it were his own. the energy thief, and the principle that every hour has a purpose or an owner. Time is the most democratic resource in existence. Every man who has ever lived, regardless of the disparity of his circumstances and as in every other respect, received the same 24 hours in each day that every other man received. The wealthy man and the man of modest means began each morning with an identical allocation. The difference between them in almost every case I have studied, where the difference was not merely inherited, was not in the numbers available, but in the organization of those hours around a definite purpose. A man who would succeed must learn to treat his hours with at least as much care as he treats his money. More, in fact, because money that is lost can sometimes be recovered through effort and ingenuity. But an hour consumed is gone with a permanence that admits no recovery. It exists once spent only as a record of what it produced or failed to produce in the direction of the man's definite chief aim. I want to describe a woman whose story illustrates what becomes possible when this principle is genuinely grasped. At nearly 50 years of age, she was working as a stenographer at $15 a week. By the salary she received, she was not particularly competent even at that. By every outward measure, this woman had no particular qualification for extraordinary achievement. There was no indication in her station or her circumstances that her name would ever be known beyond the office in which she typed letters for other people's purposes. Within the following year, she had cleared more than $100,000 on the lecture platform. What bridged that distance? Not talent acquired suddenly, not a fortunate inheritance, the habit of performing more service and better service than that for which she was paid, which gave her through the law of increase and better service than that for which she was paid, which gave her through the law of increasing returns, a return in proportion that conventional wage earning could not approach. And implicit in this habit was the corollary that the hours she spent on freely rendered service were hours organized around a purpose that was her own, rather than hours consumed by the aimless demands of those who had no particular claim upon them. The man in a man's inner circle who consumes hours without returning value for what is taken, who calls without purpose, visits without agenda, speaks without content, and leaves having contributed nothing to the shared environment, is not engaged in friendship in any sense that this philosophy would recognize. He is engaged in what I call time theft. And it operates with the same mathematical certainty as any other form of theft. The man whose hours are taken is left with fewer hours for the work that matters. The practical instruction I offered throughout the law of success on the subject of service beyond payment, render useful service to at least one person every day for which you neither expect nor accept monetary pay, carries an implied corollary. Accept no claim upon your hours from those who render no equivalent service in return. The principle of exchange that governs every transaction in the natural world governs this one as well. You cannot simultaneously give your hours to a purpose and give them to a man who has no purpose. The law does not permit the double expenditure. The man who cannot account for how his hours are being spent has not yet taken possession of his own life. Begin with the recognition that every hour is a decision and that only the people who serve the purpose of those hours or who enrich it in some demonstrable way have a legitimate claim upon them. Behavior 9. The man who mocks what he does not have the courage to pursue. The mocker. And why Hill reserved his most direct warning for this final behavior. I want to close this discourse with the behavior that I consider the most instructive of the 9, not because its damage is greater than the others in every case, but because understanding its root explains something essential about the nature of human failure and the particular form of protection a man needs against it. Throughout my 25 years of study, I observed a pattern in the men who failed that was so consistent, so predictable, and so precise in its operation that I came to regard it as one of the most reliable laws of failure I had ever encountered. The pattern is this: the man who mocks what he lacks the courage to pursue has not arrived at his mockery through reasoning. He has arrived at it through the operation of a natural psychological defense. The defense of a man who knows beneath the mockery that the thing he is ridiculing is the thing he was made to do and has not begun. Consider what happened when men of negative minds told F.W. Woolworth that he would go bankrupt trying to run a store on 5-cent and 10-cent sales. These men were not stupid. They had accumulated real experience in the conduct of commerce. Their knowledge of the conventional wisdom of their trade was genuine. What they lacked was not knowledge. It was the courage to pursue an idea that departed from the conventional pattern of how commerce was conducted. And because they lacked that courage, the most efficient defense available to a mind that will not pursue a thing but cannot honestly say it is impossible was mockery. They told him it could not be done. He did not believe them. He exercised what I have always called the divine right of the man who has settled upon a definite chief aim, the right to keep other men's negative suggestions out of his mind. He piled up a fortune exceeding $100 million. The mockers are forgotten. Men with negative minds told Thomas Edison he could not build a machine that would record and reproduce the human voice, because no one else had ever built such a machine. Men with negative minds told George Washington he could not hope to win against the vastly superior forces arrayed against him. Men with negative minds laughed when Henry Ford drove his first crude automobile through the streets of Detroit. Ford said he would belt the earth with dependable motor cars, and he did. The mocker in a man's inner circle operates through the law of hypnotic rhythm in the most insidious possible way, because his target is not the man's confidence in a particular plan. It is the man's confidence in his own capacity to judge what is possible. A single contemptuous response to a plan delivered by a person whose opinion a man respects seeds a doubt that grows if it is watered by repetition, by sustained association with a mind that habitually meets new ideas with ridicule, into the habit of prejudging one's own plans from the mocker's perspective before he ever hears them. This is the most destructive possible form of negative self-suggestion, the internalization of another man's mockery as one's own private voice of doubt. And once established through hypnotic rhythm as the automatic first response to one's own ideas, it is genuinely difficult to dislodge. I had occasion in my own experience to test the response to this behavior that I now recommend to every man who encounters it. A journalist mounted over the course of years a sustained campaign against my reputation. He attacked my work repeatedly with what I can only describe as a particular malice. For 4 or 5 years, I observed my policy of paying no attention. Eventually, his attacks became bold enough that I decided to override my policy and respond directly. I sat at my typewriter and began to write the reply. As I wrote, the anger built. I assembled what I believe was, in my career as a writer, the most thoroughly cutting collection of words I had ever organized on a single subject. I wrote until there was nothing left to write. And then, as I finished the last line, something unexpected happened. The bitterness was gone. In its place was something I did not anticipate: compassion, a feeling of sympathy, even of forgiveness. Not in the sense of condoning what had been done, but in the precise sense of recognizing that this man was a man held in place by his own limits, doing the only thing available to a mind that cannot build anything of its own. I took the paper from the typewriter and did not send it. I made instead a permanent policy decision. My work would be my sole answer to every man who mocked my efforts. My deeds would explain my motives. The world builds its monuments and bestows its honors upon the builders. It forgets its destroyers. The big prizes of life go to the builders, and the energy required to strike back at mockers is the same energy from which the building is made. The closing, the inner circle as the architecture of everything. 9 behaviors, 9 specific instruments through which the closest associations of a man's life can be turned against his ambition, his faith, and his capacity for organized, purposeful achievement. Not through malice, not through conspiracy, but through the simple mechanical operation of a law that most men never examine. The law of hypnotic rhythm works upon whatever is most frequently repeated in a man's environment of close association. It takes those repetitions and makes them permanent as the grooves cut in a wax record by the needle's repeated passage. The man who cut in a wax record by the needle's repeated passage. The man who does not choose his environment with deliberate care is not avoiding this law. He is submitting to it while believing he is neutral. There is no neutrality in this matter. Nature forces every living thing within the range of a given environment to become harmoniously related to the dominating influence of that environment. This is not philosophy. It is observation drawn from 25 years of studying both the conditions that produce great achievement and the conditions that produce its absence. The one practical escape from the operation of this law upon the negative influences in a man's environment is the same escape that nature herself provides. The deliberate, sustained, organized establishment of a positive environment to replace the negative one. This is done through the mastermind, through the intentional alliance of minds organized in harmony around a definite purpose, each bringing to the alliance something that supplements the capacity of every other. The man who builds such an alliance around himself and guards the entrance to that alliance with the care with which he would guard the entrance to any other critical resource has done the most important single thing available to him in the way of environmental management. Choose the inner circle with the same care with which you would choose the physician who attends your body in illness. Because what enters through association builds the mind with precisely the same reliability as what enters through diet builds the body. And the mind, once built by the repeated deposits of a given environment, produces through the law of hypnotic rhythm the life that those deposits point toward. You now know the 9 behaviors. You know the law that makes them dangerous. You know the evidence from the lives of men who tolerated them and men who did not. What you do with this knowledge is the only question that remains. And the answer to that question, the decision about what you will and will not permit into the closest proximity of your mind, is not a decision that can be made later without cost. Every day of continued tolerance is another day of deposits made by the wrong environment into the structure of the mind that will produce the life you either claim or forfeit. Decide today. Protect the inner circle as the most valuable territory you possess because it is.